Hi everyone and welcome to this tutorial on motion tracking. I've been doing this for quite a while now, so I thought it'd be quite a good opportunity to put together all the bits I've learned, the holes that I've fallen into, and try and help you guys out if you're a first-time motion tracker. The place to start would be actually around the footage itself. So typically with me, I film it myself or you get it sent in via somebody else, which typically comes with its own problems. But if I take footage that I produce, typically it comes from an iPhone. There's a couple of things you need to be aware of. Firstly is the settings on the phone. So I would typically film at 60 frames a second and 4K if I can. Typically your laptop might or your PC might struggle with anything over 4K, but the 60 frames a second is probably the most important part because with an iPhone, when it's messing about changing the exposures, you get drop frames, you get motion blur, which for the tracking algorithm within Blender can be a bit of a problem. The second thing is the motion within the footage. So typically I will walk around the scene a little bit because the way Blender's algorithm works is it needs parallax to be able to figure out where the flaw in the scene is. And for those who don't know what parallax is, if you're sat on a train and you're looking out of the window and you see the foreground's moving quicker than the background, that's called parallax. And that's kind of what Blender uses to figure out the focal point, where the flat planes are, and then gives you that solid track and the lower numbers. So that's something to be aware of. Even if you're not necessarily going to use that in your footage, it's quite good to anchor the track and then you can just snip it off at the end. And it just makes for a better track. It makes your life easier and you'll get better results quicker. So jumping into Blender, the bit you need to go for is VFX and then into motion tracking. You get this window up here. I'll pop in some footage that I've downloaded. So again, pop this in here. So straight away you can kind of see I brought this footage into Blender, set scene frames, prefetch, which basically, depending on how much RAM you've got, will allow you to then be able to scrub through the timeline of what's going on inside here, and you can go back and forth like that. I typically go into color management and change that to standard, so you don't end up with the weird color settings on there. Right, okay, cool. So hopefully I've done a decent job of this and you'll be able to track this fairly easily. Obviously, the better the footage you've got, the easier it'll be to track because there'll be more detail and there'll be a little bit more contrast for the track. So if we click normalize, I now go previous keyframe. I expand my search area to 100. I then go into tracking settings and change the correction to 0.9. Then at least then your tracking markers get cancelled if they go outside of that range. And then they don't add to the bad track. If you've got ones that's got the default, which is 7.5, sometimes you can get wild tracking markers and then they call that sort of chaos with your tracking later on. So if I scrub through this scene, it's 450 frames, you can kind of see that parallax there. So the idea being there's a slight twist in your footage because the letters on this piece of paper will be moving at different speeds. So then Blender should hopefully be able to figure out what that looks like. So if I press Control and then click anywhere, it'll start to lay down some tracking markers. For whatever reason, Blender seems to track forward quicker than it does backwards, so I would typically start at the start of your timeline, press Control-A to select them all, and then let it do its thing. So as you can see there, we've lost one on the way. You need 8 track points throughout the particular range you select to get a solid track. So I'm moving up there, just stick a few more in. See, I've deliberately picked this with a text on it because it just makes my life easier. Although we have committed one major faux pas, which is we didn't delete the default cube. So let's just get rid of that, pop back into the motion track, and all is well with the world. Right, okay, cool. So we've got probably the right amount of tracks there. They're fairly solid. And we've got a couple of like error-y ones. We'll delete those to just make it easier for track later on. Pop across into your solve, put your focal length on. So Blender has actually got really good at detecting camera settings, even if you're using an SLR or various other cameras. Once upon a time, you used to spend quite a bit of time faffing about inside track to change things like your camera settings to make sure that you've got all the right bits and pieces. But you'll see in a minute, once I click go, it figures this out pretty good. And especially if you're using portraits versus to landscape, that used to cause loads of problems as well. But now it seems to have sorted that out, which saves you quite a lot of faffing about. So if I click solve camera motion, There we go. We've got an interesting result here of 45. So let's find out where the rogue ones are. And then if you look in this graph here, it should mimic the movement of the twist. So you'll see there's like consistent arcs within the track. Anything that kind of goes wildly out of that typically will be causing you a solve error within, unless it's like this one here, it's quite a long way away from these ones. So you would expect that curve to be slightly higher. This one here, I think, which was that one, is gone completely bonkers. So we'll delete that. And then I'll just run through what some of these settings are here. So what Blender's trying to do is between this keyframe range, figure out the motion. And all the advice I've seen is if you pick a keyframe range where there's the most dramatic motion within the scene, that will guarantee you the best amount of accuracy when it comes to the track. So you can see here, there's probably this point here between 320 and 400, or the main map twist in the scene is between 180 and 240. So let's try that. 180 and 240. 240. Whoop. All right, let's see if that solves anything. There you go. Now you've gone down to 0.3 straight away without any messing about. And that should secure you a very accurate track. So the other thing to note, and it's not done it on here, which is good, is this blue line is crucial. This is the smoothness of the camera motion. So what will tend to happen is sometimes you'll get a really low solve error, but then when you look in here, I've not got an example of it, but you'll see like a spike. Now that, once you bring it into your scene, will be like a jolt in your camera, which when you're trying to do a motion track and make it look like something's anchored in the scene, this is not great. On this example, we haven't got any. Usually it will happen when you've had to add additional tracking points and they just slam into the scene, which then causes the algorithm to be like, oh my God, what's this extra piece? And then it creates like a little dip. So the way to solve that is you can either change the influence, which is, sorry, the weight within here, or you can then try and run that tracking marker back throughout the scene. So if you click say something like this and then do the reverse track, it will move that tracking marker further down the scene, or just delete it depending on how it works, then rerun it. I can't tell you the amount of hours I've spent basically like solving and resolving to try and get this down to something as low as this. On 4K footage, 0.3 of a pixel error for the markers is incredibly good. You can tend to push it a little bit if you've got 4K because you've got loads of resolution to kind of hide the jerkiness, so there's no need to do any of the cleanup. So typically if you've got tons of markers and they're wildly out, I would start like, I don't know, if you've got a solve error of 150, start at 200 and then just make sure you click clean tracks rather than filter tracks, and you'll find if there's any like rogue tracks and delete them en masse. It just saves a bit of time. Right, okay, cool. So uncharacteristically, we've got a really good solve error. The next stage for this is to set up your background of sight tracking scene, which will put loads of stuff in Blender. Top tip, take your ground and move it into the foreground, because for whatever reason, when you go to the rendered view, it doesn't work. I delete these because I don't need them. I'll do another tutorial on what they are later on, and the same within here, background, because what will end up happening is for every frame you will have two render layers, which then will double the time for your render, which is not good, because especially if there's no difference between the two, and render layers is a whole different subject on top of itself. So what's next? You've set your tracking scene. If you press 0 on your numpad, it will then show you kind of what you've got there. Again, so uncharacteristically, it's not changed what the camera view is. So let's have a look at that, which is very unusual. CPU to GPU. Just turn these down to 10, just because if you accidentally press F12 and you've got a slow laptop, you'll either crash Blender, or it'll just take forever. The other thing to tick if you've got a GPU is to use a GPU for the denoiser, because again, that will half your render time. I think that's everything. Let's have a look at the camera settings. It's very strange. All right, let's just have another look at that. So it's got 300, 340 to 440. Let's see what it does. Okay, cool. There we go, look. Right, okay, cool. So that now should have fixed the camera. So we'll go into sizes. Okay, to here. Cool. Right, okay. So this is what you kind of want when you look here. You can see your track markers are stuck to where they need to be on your footage. So that's now in the right resolution. So if you press start 2, that'll then break it back to 4K footage, which is what I've got in. Oh no, I haven't actually. Tell a lie. I think for the tutorial I actually did 4K at HD, mainly so that my machine ran properly. Okay, cool. So what we now need to do is tell Blender where the center is. So if we pick the middle of the footage and go down to solve again, and then underneath set origin, right, so that'll pop right in the middle. And then we also need to tell it where the floor is, which is 3 points that are currently active in the frame range that you've got selected, which I've got there. Luckily, this footage, all the frames survive all the way through without erroring, so that's good, so we can pick them all. And hopefully what should happen now, if I click floor, so there we go, it's snapped to that. And then if I pick 2 points and then set the scale, that is, right, okay, cool. So you can see now, we're kind of getting to something. So if we click there and then set origin, that'll pop it to the middle. And that should be a pretty solid track, which it kind of looks like it is. The X and Y axis are not right. So what we then need to do is tell it where the Z is. So that pops it to, sorry, the X even will pop it to there. And then there you've got your track of 0.3. So that's pretty solid. So that for me, make sure I save the file. Track tutorial. Spell it right. Make sure that's saved. And then we can then say goodbye to the motion track part and go back into the layout. Press 0. There's a few little bits on here, so we'll just get that shade flat, make that bigger. Yoop. Then if you go to the render settings, everything will disappear. So you need to go into film underneath your viewport settings, click transparent, and your camera will come back. And then as you notice, we've deleted all the lights out of there. So what I would normally do in this scenario is, just for ease of use, is I would set an environment texture because it's easier on your machine, but also yeah, so I'll call this up result and Photoshop, and that's okay. Cool. So we've now got that set up. There's one other little trick I like to do as well, is the ground plane that we've got here. You'll notice if you go into its visibility, and if you turn off shadow catcher, it's white, but the table's obviously not white. And what that's doing, as you can see, the highlights all over it, kind of messes up what that looks like. So if I go to shade editor, if I can select it, but for some reason, how do I get visibility record better out of the way? Yeah, well, that's great. Thanks, screen recording tool. I can't select my options, so I'll have to do it this way. Shade editor, go to new, and then if you press Control T, which if you've got Node Wrangler on, if you go into preferences, and you go to add-ons and you type in Node, make sure you turn that on. That's very helpful for keyboard shortcuts. What this will allow us to do now is add image texture downloads, the footage back in to act as the, okay, make sure we side click, give that the amount of frames it needs. And we've got there 464. Click go on that. So what you should start to see now, if you press /, you should be able to pick material one floor, that's fine. Should turn shadow catcher off. And if you go to texture coordinates, put window on. So what you'll get now is, no matter where it is, you'll get the straight through to the footage. But then what you'll notice now is, if I turn shadow catcher back on, you get more realistic shadows. You can also do add a bump on there as well. Press was it Control A or is it Shift A? Right, oh, don't do that. Yeah, Shift A, and put bump in there. So if you've got like a rough floor or something like that, you can stick that into there, go into the height, turn that right down. So that'll behave itself a little bit. See, to me, that the lighting doesn't look quite right on there. If you look at where the shadows are going on here, there's some direct down lighting, so I might just change the HRI, EXR, EXR. Got 'em, yeah, that's good. Try that one. Nope. A good site to go to for any HDRIs is HDRI Haven. They've got tons of great HDRIs that you can choose from. That's got a top light on it, so hopefully. Fair enough, that's just light spot. Well, to 1,000. Now I'm getting somewhere. Cool. But also look at as well, as you go to the camera settings, you can actually change the background image, crank the opacity up to give you a bit of a true reflection of what's going on. I might even turn the world down a little bit. Nope, not that much. What you can also do inside of here is if you go to world settings, press Control T again, Control T, you can actually spin the HDRI around, so then you can kind of see where your shadows are going. So if I just delete that out there for a second, and then if I go, you probably want to turn off your transparent, so you can kind of see where your world is. And then if you go to your rotation, you can sort of start to spin around. And you should be able to start to see where your sort of shadows are coming in and out from. I usually turn the transparent off because I always get the dimensions wrong and then have to do it anyway. So right, okay, cool. So we can start to spin that around. You can kind of see the shadow. So there we go. Look, so we've got that there now. That's perfect. Go back to the world settings, turn that back up to 1. Okay, cool. You can also do loads of other things in here, like changing the hue and saturation, because if you notice, that paper's quite blue and that should really match there. So if I go to hue, stick that, oh, that's not right. Hue and saturation. There we go. Can I stick it in there? Oh, I did stick it in there. And then if you click, just crank that up to something ridiculous, because then you can start to see different hue values. Oh, if you really want to go into it, you can actually do a little HDRI for yourself. Cool. So, next thing to look at, now you've got your solid track, you've got your item in the scene, we've then added, if I press Alt-Z to get ghost mode, this should play nice and steady. So you can tell if you look, your frame rate will tell you like how far off you actually are on the lag, because sometimes if you've got a really complicated scene, it'll look like the track's terrible because the frame rate's not rendering fast enough. But if I drag it through, that's pretty solid. Right, okay, cool. So the next thing is then is to go into the compositor, which is helpfully behind my record button. And I have yet to figure out how to move it, so just bear with me a second. I think, is it that one? Nope. There we go. Perfect. So as you can see here, we've got this additional render layer, which we don't need. So this gets all set up when you click set up tracking scene. So you'll get your footage being brought in and then your render layer. So if you press F12 just to get a quick render, there we go. Okay, that'll be white because we've broken this. Delete the alpha over, drag that into there. If you press Shift and right click, you can then create a little point on the top of there and drag that back in there. So now you can see we've got that in there. You go to view and fit. The other thing to think about on here as well is if you go to options and GPU, that'll also use the GPU rather than the CPU, which will make the render slightly faster. So what do I do on here just for what I typically do is if you go to Lens distortion, because for me now it's about trying to make it look like it's part of the scene rather than stuck on top of. So I tend to add a little bit of lens distortion, alpha over, and then drag it into there. Turn jitter on. Lens distortion is 0.02, tends to be quite a nice one. 0.02. Turn the jitter off. It's going to start to, what you should start to see is zoom in and then move that. If I go to 1, render it as itself, so you can start to see we're starting to soften the edges a little bit. And then, because typically iPhone footage is really heavily contrasted, you kind of want to do a little bit of softening and sharpening to your render layer to try and make it look like it's part of the scene. So if you press Shift and A again, and then type in filter, put that in there, and then if you press Shift and D, you can duplicate that, change that one to box sharpen, and then take that right down. So what you're kind of doing is softening and then sharpening, and then just try and break down some of those edges. So if I crank the samples up to something like 32, you'll start to see we're starting to get that sort of nice soft edge, so it looks like it's part of the footage. What else do I do on there? Again, the radial distortion tends to do a little bit of that as well. So if you crank it up to the extreme, you should start to see how that sort of gives you that nice soft edge with the lens bokeh as well, which we get in real life. Put that back to 0.02. Again, your preference, how far you want to take it, but kind of get the idea. So that's that. What else do I need to do? You need to set up your render settings. So make sure that's at the same frame rate of the footage that you've taken. So that's 29.97. Make sure your output's in the right place. Videos. Come on. Although did I film that at 60 frames a second? Don't think I did. I think it was 30. FMP video, color management, nope. Encoding, this is important. Make sure it's MP4, and then change it from medium quality to perceptually lossless. That has to work quite nice. And give it a name like tracking render. Save that, and then it's as simple as Control F12, and then leave it to do its thing.